In this week's Bible in a Year Challenge reading, we're still working in the book of Matthew in the New Testament. And one of the events that we work through in Matthew is an account where Jesus cast out demons from a couple of men. It's a good story. Jesus shows up, he's confronted with these guys, there's a discussion. Jesus casts the demons out into some pigs. The pigs run into some water and they die. There's a whole lot that we can take away from this. We see Jesus' power demonstrated. We learn about the power of demons. We understand that demons recognize who Jesus is. I could go on and on. Good story, good thing to work through. Well, today I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about this story, but more specifically, some difficulties that there are with this story. And to really understand these difficulties, we need to move outside of just the book of Matthew to really get a perspective on this. As you know, we've got 4 different Gospels in the New Testament, and there's a lot of overlap between them. There's some events that are captured in 1, 2, 3, 4 of the Gospels. And in this case, this story shows up in Matthew, it shows up in Mark, and I think it also shows up briefly in Luke. And when we read through these stories, it's clear that it's talking about the same story, but some of the details are a little bit different. Let me read you the first sentence from the account in Matthew, and then I'll read you the first sentence from the account in Mark, and then we'll talk about what we see that's different. Matthew chapter 8, verse 28, and this is talking about Jesus. When he arrived at the other side in the region of the Gadarenes, 2 demon-possessed men coming from the tombs met him. They were so violent that no one could pass that way. That's the beginning of the account in Matthew. Here's the beginning of Mark. They went across the lake to the region of the Gerasenes. When Jesus got out of the boat, a man with an impure spirit came from the tombs to meet him. So again, we've got the same story, the same historical event kicking off, but there's a couple of differences between these 2 accounts. In the book of Matthew, it says that Jesus went to the region of the Gadarenes, and there he met 2 demon-possessed men, yet the account that we just read from the book of Mark says he went to the region of the Gerasenes, where he encountered only 1 man. Mark only mentioned 1 person. So this is a little bit different, right? Different places, different number of folks involved. And most scholars look at these events and despite these discrepancies or these seeming differences between the accounts, almost everybody's on board that both of these accounts are talking about the very same event. This is not a case where Jesus goes to one place and heals 2 men and then goes to another place and heals just 1. Most everybody is on board that this is a single event, but we have to deal with why they look a little bit different. And here is where some controversy begins. Of course, a lot of people simply throw up their hands and say, well, here's more contradictions in the Bible again. We have to throw out the whole book because it just doesn't hold together. And if we're going to be at least slightly intellectually honest, before we give up, we should at least spend a little bit of time and try to look at what the Word of God says and see if there's some reasonable explanation for why there's some apparent differences. And if we do that, then I think we, as always, you'll see come up with some very satisfying answers. So in this case, we've got 2 different seeming discrepancies we want to work through. We have a difference of location, and we have a difference in the number of people. Let's start first talking about the difference in location. Now here we've got a little bit of a challenge because we don't have any good detailed maps from this time. This took place over 2,000 years ago, and the fact of the matter is we don't know the names of every city, every province, every nation, every location that was around at that time. We have a good idea about some things, and so there's experts out there who are much smarter than I am who can make a compelling argument that in modern day this place or modern day that place is exactly what's being talked about here. But the fact of the matter is there is a lot that we don't know. And let's just take for granted that it's entirely possible if you were there at that time some 2,000 years ago and you heard these 2 different descriptors, you might notice an interconnectedness or be aware of an interconnectedness between them that we're just not aware of today. But even if we're not going to rely on that, because that's going to be an argument from silence, let's look at something else. So leveraging some experts in this area, we can look into the original Greek to give us a little bit more of a clue. Now, I have to admit this is getting a little bit beyond my level of expertise, but this is not a very controversial thing that I'm about to explain. Most experts seem to agree that in the account in Matthew, when he's talking about the region of the Gadarenes, he's referring to a nation. nation, the region of the Gadarenes. But in Mark, when Mark says the region of the Gerasenes, what he's talking about with the Gerasenes there is not a nation, but a people group. Now, this is a very interesting thing. Yeah, it's still mentioning two different names, but maybe it's not so strange for these two things to be side by side and have these obviously be referring to the same event. Let me give you an example here. It's January right now in Montana, but let's say the weather gets even warmer than it is now. It's unseasonably warm. And let's say next week we're in for some 60-degree weather for whatever reason. It'd be pretty nice out, and it wouldn't be a crazy thing for me to want to hop on my bike and maybe do a little bit of exploring. And let's say I got together with a couple of my friends and we decided we're going to ride north. We're going to cross the border into Canada and keep going until we hit the first major city that we come to, and we'll have dinner there. Well, let's say we go ahead and do this, and we arrive in the city that we're trying to get to, and it's time for us to have dinner, and so we see a group of people, and we stop, get off the bikes, and now let's say I approach these people, and I begin to ask them where it is that we should eat. Now, my two friends are going to be observing this happening, and we could imagine a scenario where later on my two friends relate what they saw me do, and it may come out a little bit differently. Maybe friend number one, who was on my left, would say, yeah, Tim got off his bike and then he approached some people who lived in Regina and asked them where we should have dinner. And my other friend, the one who was on my right, maybe relates what happened to a different person at a different time. He might have said, Tim approached a few Canadians and asked them where we should eat. Now, these two men referred to the group very differently. One was talking about a people group, one was talking about a geographic location. Those words don't sound anything alike, but both are absolutely accurate, and there is absolutely no contradiction between either of these two accounts. I don't think it's a stretch at all to believe that Matthew and Mark's descriptions fall into the same type of category. It just makes sense. So that's an easy explanation for these different locations. There's more complicated possible explanations out there, but again, all of this is complicated by the fact that we don't have detailed records of every place and every people group that was around at the time. I just want to put out there that it seems perfectly reasonable to accept that both of these descriptions work simultaneously. Now let's take on this this seeming problem with the number of people who were present. And again, Matthew talks about 2 demon-possessed men, and Mark only talks about 1. But please note, Mark didn't come out and say there was only 1 man. He only spoke about one of those men. So it's entirely possible, again, that there were 2 men present, and both authors were thinking about that when they wrote it, but maybe one man just played a more prominent role, and Mark was focusing on that one man while Matthew was describing the bigger picture. I think that makes sense. And listen, in case that's feeling like a little bit of a reach to you, let's work through another example here, another description. Let's say I run into you after church at some point and you're wanting to get added to our email distribution list. That seems like a reasonable thing to do. And so you say, Tim, can you please add me to the group? And I say, sure, what's your email address? And of course you need to write that down for me because my brain is like a sieve and I'll never remember that. So you got a piece of scrap paper, but you don't have anything to write with. So you ask me, Tim, do you have anything you can write with? Which time I reach into my desk, I draw out a couple of implements, and I offer them to you. Now again, let's bring my 2 biker friends back here, and let's say they were there and they witnessed this interaction, and for whatever reason they decide to relate that interaction to someone else, and they were talking about these to different people at different times. Well, my friend on my left might say, Tim reached into his drawer and he offered 2 pencils to the person who was asking for them. Yet the person on my right could simply say, Tim gave that person a pencil. Again, you have 2 different focuses on the story. Both are absolutely correct. Both are looking at it from a slightly different angle, but there is no contradiction between those 2 eyewitness accounts. Both accounts are perfectly acceptable simultaneously. Now, some other scholars have offered some much more complicated reasons for why Matthew would say 2 and Mark would say 1, and maybe they're right. The fact of the matter is we don't know, but rather than nailing down exactly why it is that we've got this difference here between the two, we can just simply recognize there could be a whole lot of reasons why these numbers would look a little bit different. And even the simple explanation that I provided here is very natural and makes perfect sense. So between these two things, I hope it's pretty clear and pretty logical that despite a slightly different description of location and a slightly different description of the number of people involved, both of these accounts can be very truthful and exist side by side without any problem. In fact, I would like to go a step further and say not only is there no conflict between Matthew's account and Mark's account, I'm going to go ahead and go out on a limb and say these differences, these subtle differences between these two accounts actually gives us more of a reason to believe that this is a true story. Follow me on this. If you talk to anyone who works in law enforcement and you talk about corroborating testimony, they will tell you if you have two witnesses to an event and you separate out those people and you ask them independently, what did you observe when whatever it is went down? If those two witnesses give you the exact same explanation, every detail the same, everything in perfect sequence, every jot and every tittle, exactly the same between those two witness statements, your law enforcement officer would not take that as a validation that this is a correct story. Instead, such perfect harmony between those two stories would suggest the story is contrived. The truth of the matter is when two different people simultaneously witness the same event and then separately recall them, they look at that event from slightly different angles. And what you see when these things have not been rehearsed and have not been planned ahead of time what information would be shared, you see a slightly different spin on the same story. You see a difference in whether you call the group of people by the nationality that they were or the physical location that they were in, or whether you describe two pencils being offered or one pencil being taken. Those are the actual differences that law enforcement officers actually look for in witness testimony to corroborate an authentic witness of events. So there you go. We have no problem between the seeming differences between the accounts of Jesus casting out the demons in the book of Matthew and in the book of Mark. Hope it's been helpful. Hope it's been interesting. And until next time, Lord willing, there is a next time. May God bless you and your family.